I was sitting across from a retired aerospace engineer a few weeks ago, a man who had spent 3 decades obsessing over tolerances measured in microns. We were watching a news segment about a recent mid-air technical failure, screaming passengers, oxygen masks dropping, the whole terrifying scene. I expected him to launch into a technical autopsy of the turbine or the fuselage. Instead, he just stared at the screen with a grim, almost haunting lack of surprise. "The bolts didn't fail first," he said quietly. "The culture did." He told me about his final year at the firm. He described a shift where the performance review, once a grueling gauntlet of technical scrutiny, had been replaced by something called a values alignment audit. He recalled a specific meeting where he pointed out a potential flaw in a supplier's stress test data. Rather than being thanked, he was pulled aside by a young administrator from a department that didn't exist 5 years ago. He wasn't told his math was wrong. He was told his tone was insufficiently collaborative, and that his insistence on rigid standards was creating an exclusionary environment. He saw the writing on the wall. The institution had stopped being an engineering firm that employed people, and it had become an ideological laboratory that happened to build planes. It was a bizarre clinical inversion of reality. To the new management, the primary goal wasn't the safety of the craft, but the ideological purity of the cubicles. That conversation stayed with me. It suggested that the mechanical failures we see in the headlines aren't just bad luck. They're the inevitable symptoms of a much deeper, quieter rot. A world where we've traded the tyranny of excellence for a very comfortable, very inclusive, and very dangerous mediocrity. And the most terrifying part, the people in charge seem to think that if they just change the narrative, the laws of physics will eventually learn to comply.
That is a chilling story. And it perfectly captures the mission for this deep dive.
It does, because it's not just a story, it's a symptom.
Exactly. We're looking at the causality here, the actual documented links between these huge systemic changes in our institutions and what seems to be a resulting decline in operational competence.
And it's happening across the board, from engineering to public administration.
Right. And the source material we've been digging into is it's incredibly broad.
It really is. It covers everything from the philosophical underpinnings of, meritocracy itself,
to the very specific documented organizational consequences of these identity-focused mandates, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI.
And then there's this larger cultural piece, this shift towards what some sociologists are calling the therapeutic state.
The therapeutic state, where, psychological safety and feelings seem to be replacing hard, objective results.
So our job here is to move past the talking points, the political back and forth,
and scrutinize the actual argument. The idea that deliberately dismantling traditional standards of merit and elevating this idea of victimhood is actively contributing to this decline.
So using the engineer's story as our guide, the central question is, well, how did we get here? How did institutions manage to invert their own reality?
And what are the specific mechanisms, philosophical, economic, cultural, that are driving this change?
Okay, let's unpack this.
To really get a handle on the debate today, we have to start at the beginning. We need to ground ourselves in what meritocracy actually is and what its original appeal was.
And it's funny because the term itself, meritocracy, was coined by a British sociologist, Michael Young, back in 1958. And he actually meant it as a joke, a satire.
He was describing a dystopia, yeah, where this credentialed elite just runs everything.
But the idea was so powerful that organizations they embraced it.
Yeah.
It came to symbolize fairness, objectivity. It became a core part of their identity.
It did. And the theory behind it is, you have to admit, very attractive. The simple belief that hard work will pay off.
Right. That everyone gets judged fairly on their results, and you can rise to your full potential no matter who you are or where you came from.
In any given field, merit is usually defined by 3 main things. First, you have relevant qualifications, like a degree or a license.
Makes sense.
Second, the prospect of making a real contribution. So your track record, your skills. Wow. And third, just plain old effort.
But most of the debate we're seeing today really focuses on that first one, right? The qualifications, the credentials.
That's the battleground. But if you go back to its original appeal, you can see why it lined up so perfectly with philosophical liberalism.
How so?
Well, it served 2 core liberal values at the same time: liberty and equality.
Okay, break that down.
So on the liberty side, in a free market, employers and universities, they're incentivized to find the best talent. They have the freedom to hire the most qualified people without the state telling them what to do.
And the equality side.
That was the revolutionary promise. A truly meritocratic institution is supposed to be blind. It doesn't care about your race, your gender, your religion.
It just cares about what you can do, your qualifications.
Exactly. In theory, in the eyes of that institution, everyone is equal at the starting gate.
Which creates a really powerful moral story.
A very powerful one. If the system is purely based on qualifications, then failure isn't because the system is rigged. It's because of an individual's lack of talent or effort.
It's a clean, elegant justification for why some people end up with more than others in a society that claims to value equality.
But, and this is the key, the philosophical sources we've looked at argue that this whole elegant vision had a fatal flaw, an Achilles heel.
And what's that?
The system just got too good at identifying and rewarding the inequalities that already existed.
So that's the pivot point. That's when you start to see this surge of critical anti-meritocratic scholarship. People like Michael Sandel, Daniel Markovits.
Right. And it was partly triggered by these massive political earthquakes, things like Brexit, the election of Donald Trump. These thinkers looked at that and said, okay, something is fundamentally broken in our social contract.
The diagnosis wasn't just about money. It was about resentment, this deep moral divide between the highly credentialed, wealthy elite.
And the working and middle classes who just felt like the system didn't value them anymore.
And that's where the core philosophical objection comes in. The idea that meritocracy's promise of equality is, well, it's just superficial.
Completely. The critics say, sure, institutions might be blind to who you are when you walk in the door. But the second they look at your resume, at your qualifications,
all those pre-existing inequalities in education and background suddenly become the only thing that matters.
And that's the basis for everything that follows, all the rewards. Which brings us to a really crucial distinction you have to understand.
The difference between the descriptive and the normative sense of the word.
Exactly. So descriptively, meritocracy is just. It's just how institutions give out rewards based on qualifications. It's a fact. It's like saying a bank gives out loans based on credit scores.
Okay, that's the what?
But the normative sense, the ideological one, that's what the critics are really attacking.
This is the part that goes further and says that the system is not just efficient, but it's morally good.
Precisely. It's the ideology that says institutions are rewarding some kind of pre-existing moral desert, and so the people who succeed deserve to succeed. The anti-meritocrats absolutely hate that language of desert.
Because if you go down that road, you're not just saying the successful are successful. You're saying they morally deserve their wealth and status.
And implicitly, that those who fail morally deserve their failure. The critics argue this isn't just false, it's actively harmful. It's a kind of a false consciousness.
Let's unpack that for a second. False consciousness.
So the ideology tells the successful that they're just good, hardworking, deserving people, and that helps them feel better about their incredible privilege.
It soothes their guilt.
Right. And at the same time, it tells the unsuccessful that their failure is all on them. It's personal. And that stops them from seeing it as a systemic problem.
So it keeps a whole system in place by convincing everyone that the rules are fair, even if the game is rigged.
And that is the perfect bridge. If the philosophical critique exposes the moral emptiness of the idea, the economic and sociological critiques, they bring the receipts. They provide the evidence that the system is, in fact, structurally rigged from the very beginning.
Okay, so let's move from the philosophy to the hard data. The anti-meritocrats build this case that the system isn't just morally questionable, it's structurally rigged. And their first big objection is this idea of the social lottery.
Right. The premise is really straightforward. For meritocracy to have any legitimacy at all, everybody has to start from more or less the same place.
A level playing field.
But if the system can't deliver that fair equality of opportunity, then any reward that comes later, it's basically illegitimate. And the criticism is that initial inequality just snowballs. It creates this compounding advantage for the wealthy that starts, believe it or not, right at conception.
And the sources document this in incredible detail. It starts before a child even sees a classroom. The data suggests that wealthy mothers tend to be less stressed during pregnancy,
which is statistically correlated with higher IQ scores and better developmental outcomes for their children.
And then you add the stability factor. Wealthier families have more stable households. Parents can afford to take time off. They live in better neighborhoods with better schools. Or they just skip all that and pay for private education.
Private tutors, culturally enriching extracurriculars, the list just goes on and on.
And the performance gaps this creates aren't small. They're colossal. The data from the US and UK is just staggering. Students from families earning over $200,000 a year score, on average, 388 points higher on the SAT than students from families earning under $20,000.
388 points. That's a massive, massive gap. It tells you everything you need to know about resource distribution.
And it's not just about buying better schools. It's buying immersion in the kinds of activities, debate, music, competitive sports that develop the exact skills the meritocratic system values most.
Okay, but let's pause there, because this is where I think people would push back. The counterargument is, okay, but those score differences are real. They reflect genuine qualifications that were gained because of those resources. The rich kids actually are better prepared.
So the problem isn't the test, it's the unequal resources that got them there. How do the sources handle that?
That is the absolute heart of the debate. And the sources would agree the qualifications gained are often real. They are predictive of success within the current system. But the system itself is structured to amplify that privilege. So elite education stops being an engine of social mobility, and it becomes a privilege multiplier. The whole mechanism is selection.
And the scale of that selection is...
The sources cite that at the 150 most selective colleges in the U.S., students from the top income quartile outnumber students from the bottom quartile by a factor of 14 to 1.
14 to 1.
Think about that ratio, 14 to 1. It means our education system, which is supposed to be about opportunity, is actually one of the most efficient mechanisms we have for transmitting privilege across generations.
So it basically launders wealth into credentials. It takes the kids of the wealthy, gives them the most valuable degrees, and then sends them out into the job market with this huge self-justifying advantage.
Which is what breeds that resentment and hopelessness we talked about earlier. And that leads directly to the second major economic objection, the arbitrariness of what the market rewards.
Okay, so even if we could magically create perfect equality of opportunity.
Even then, the critics say the system is still broken, because the skills that get rewarded depend entirely on market demand, which they argue is just morally arbitrary.
And there are two reasons for that. The first is just plain market luck.
Yeah, sheer luck. Which skills happen to be in high demand right now? You know, being a master weaver might have made you rich in the 1880s, but it's not going to do much for you today.
Whereas a computer science degree is a golden ticket.
For now. But its value is totally contingent on the current economy. The argument is that this has no real moral basis. It's just timing.
Okay, so that's the first reason. The second one is a little more conspiratorial sounding. The idea that demand for certain skills is manufactured by the people who have them.
It's this idea of professional closure.
Yeah.
Highly educated professionals, once they're in the managerial class, start creating these unnecessary layers of required credentials. They shift the goalpost to make sure only people with similar elite backgrounds can get in.
So they essentially create a demand for their own credentials, whether or not those credentials actually add any real value.
Exactly. It's a cycle. The elite not only create the criteria that only they can meet, but they also create the perception that those criteria are absolutely essential.
It sounds like, as you said, a rigged game. And it undermines the whole idea that meritocracy is inherently just.
Which brings us to the third and maybe the most forceful objection, that meritocracy by its very nature creates extreme inequality and societal hubris.
Well, of course it creates inequality. It's designed to steer more wealth to people with more qualifications.
True. But the critique, especially from someone like Daniel Markovits, is that it produces extreme inequality. And it does that because of its relentless drive for excellence.
How does that work? How does pursuing excellence lead to extreme inequality?
Because modern capitalism and technology allow the system to identify ever finer, ever more microscopic gradations of skill. Think about high-frequency trading or complex data science. The tiny difference in talent between the top 0.1% and the top 1% can generate a massively disproportionate amount of wealth.
And as our tools get better at spotting those tiny differences,
the wealth automatically flows to an ever smaller group of people at the very, very top.
And that's the mechanism that hollows out the middle class and concentrates wealth in the top 1%, driving all that resentment we started with.
This point connects directly to older socialist and Marxist critiques. They've always argued that merit in capitalism is just your ability to generate profit. It's not about your intelligence or your effort or your contribution to society.
So meritocracy becomes the perfect cover story for that inequality.
Exactly. It hides all the structural barriers, class, race, gender, by framing success and failure as purely individual. If you didn't make it, it's your fault. You weren't smart enough or you didn't work hard enough.
Which brings us back to Bourdieu and his concept of social reproduction. This is the mechanism that makes it all work.
Right. Bourdieu argued the education system isn't a neutral filter, it's an active machine. It takes the cultural knowledge of the wealthy and powerful.
The cultural capital.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The way you speak, your tastes, your confidence, all those subtle codes of power you learn from birth if you're in that circle.
And the education system then takes that inherited fluency and mistakes it for natural talent.
It disguises social selection as academic evaluation. And the outcome is that you reinforce class divisions, but you do it under this perfect guise of neutrality. On paper, everyone was judged by the same standards.
Which makes the system feel unbreakable because it looks fair on the surface. That's the rigging.
And it's that perceived rigging that created the moral and intellectual justification for the rise of DEI.
Right. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
Yeah.
And you have to say the intentions behind them are laudable.
Absolutely. DEI is explicitly designed to counteract all those unfair disadvantages we just talked about, to address unconscious bias, microaggressions, historical exclusion.
So organizations set up formal strategies, inclusive leadership training, DEI audit committees, specific recruiting targets.
They establish clear metrics, employee satisfaction, retention rates for different groups, and they build these roadmaps to try and create a more harmonious workplace.
The training itself usually has two parts, right? First is awareness.
Right. Awareness of stereotyping, the importance of diversity, cross-cultural sensitivity.
Yeah.
And the second part is skill building. So how to actually manage diverse teams and navigate those cultural differences.
So that's the intent. That's the theory.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources also document a very different organizational reality. A lot of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
A backfire.
And this is where it clashes directly with those deeply ingrained meritocratic principles that still run high-stakes fields like engineering or medicine. And the most common complaint you hear is the perception of reverse discrimination.
This is where the organizational studies get really interesting.
They do. One study documented a case where a high-performing employee, a white male, felt he was passed over for a promotion he deserved because the company needed to meet its diversity goals. Now, whether that decision was legally defensible or not is almost beside the point.
The perception was that merit had been violated.
Exactly. And when people feel the system is unfair, trust just evaporates instantly. And it's not just about promotions, it's about the purpose of the organization itself getting distorted.
You mean the token efforts that managers report?
Yes, what some critics call woke washing. One manager described it as, changing the company logo to a rainbow for Pride Month, posting some random HR stuff on LinkedIn.
All for optics, to manage public perception rather than enact real change.
Right. The organization starts prioritizing the external appearance of ideological alignment over its core mission.
Which brings us right back to our aerospace engineer and his values alignment audit. When the focus is on signaling virtue, the internal commitment to technical excellence can easily get pushed aside.
And that leads to the most dangerous consequence of all: the erosion of trust in competence itself.
How does that happen?
Well, DEI mandates can inadvertently create what's called a culture of mistrust. It fosters a perception both inside and outside the company that maybe that pilot or that surgeon or that fire chief, maybe they're in that position because of a diversity initiative, not because they were the absolute best person for the job.
And that's a devastating, corrosive thought. Even if it's unspoken, it undermines the credibility of that person.
The sources noted this exact thing happening in the Department of Defense. Even when high-performing women or minority leaders are objectively killing it, they're still fighting this silent question of whether they got there on merit or because of a mandate.
So they have to work twice as hard just to prove they belong, all because the system itself is now perceived as compromised.
And it's really important to distinguish between the three letters here, D, E, and I, diversity and inclusion. Most people see those as pretty good goals.
Yeah, having variety and making people feel welcome, what's wrong with that?
Right. But equity, the E, that's the term that triggers the most intense criticism and dysfunction.
Why is that one so controversial?
Because in this context, equity is often defined as equality of outcome through unequal treatment.
Meaning you give preferential treatment to certain groups to hit your numbers.
Exactly. And when you mandate preferential hiring to hit a metric, it just offends people's basic intuitive sense of fairness. It violates that core meritocratic idea that standards should be universal and applied blindly.
So the attempt to fix the unequal starting line ends up breaking the promise of a fair race.
And that leads directly to the reverse selection concern. This is the organizational gear that connects ideological purity to dangerous mediocrity.
Walk us through how that works.
Okay, imagine you're a manager in a high-stakes engineering division. You're under intense pressure to hit your DEI hiring metrics. And if you don't, you get a bad review, you lose your bonus, you're under the microscope.
So the incentives are very real.
Very real. And you have two candidates. Candidate A is objectively the most qualified technical expert, but doesn't fit the diversity profile you need. Candidate B is adequate. They meet the profile, but they are not the best technical fit.
The incentive structure is completely warped.
It is. The manager is now incentivized to choose candidate B, the mediocre but compliant one, just to avoid getting in trouble. The system is pushing you to prioritize checking a box over demonstrated competence.
And that's the direct link back to the engineer's story. When the punishment for failing the ideological audit is greater than the punishment for a technical failure, managers will always choose ideological safety.
Always. And once you start compromising standards in these high-stakes fields, whether it's stress test data for a plane or admission standards for medical school, the entire structure of competence starts to decay.
The focus shifts from the hard, unforgiving laws of physics
to the soft, malleable requirements of internal values alignment.
This organizational inversion we're talking about, where political fear outweighs technical fear, it's mirrored by this huge cultural inversion, the rise of what's being called victimhood currency and the cry bully phenomenon.
A critical sociological shift. And our sources define a cry bully as someone who falsely claims to be a victim or who fakes emotional pain, specifically to manipulate or coerce other people.
It's a really powerful social tactic, especially online. Victim status has become a form of social capital.
Immense social capital. Claiming you're a victim can immediately shut down legitimate criticism. It mobilizes your followers, these knights on white horses, to come and defend you. And it allows you to completely avoid accountability.
It's a calculated exploitation of empathy.
It is. And the core psychological tactic has been formalized into this acronym, DARVO.
DARVO. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender.
Right. So first, you're called out for bad behavior. You deny it happened or you minimize it. Then you attack the person who accused you. You question their motives, their character.
And then the crucial move.
You reverse victim and offender. You flip the entire script so that suddenly you are the one who's been wronged. You're the one being persecuted. And just like that, all accountability is deflected.
And the sources are really clear that this isn't new. This is an ancient power move.
Oh, absolutely. History is full of powerful figures who mastered this. Think about Richard Nixon during Watergate. The evidence was overwhelming, but he didn't apologize. He painted himself as the victim of a liberal media witch hunt.
I am not a crook. It was a perfect piece of DARVO.
Or take a more extreme case, King Leopold II of Belgium. His regime killed millions in the Congo. When the reports came out, he didn't admit guilt. He launched a PR campaign claiming he was the victim of slander from jealous rivals.
He framed his atrocities as a selfless humanitarian mission.
Even someone like the Roman Emperor Nero. When he was finally declared a public enemy, he spent his last moments complaining about how unfairly everyone had treated him. It's the same pattern over and over.
The only difference today is the speed and the visibility that social media gives it.
And this cultural trend, this elevation of manufactured victimhood to escape accountability, it's supported by a much bigger sociological phenomenon, the therapeutic state.
That's a term from 1963. It describes a political system that uses the language of medicine and therapy to justify state coercion.
Exactly. It replaces traditional ideas of law and punishment with therapy and treatment.
And the key move is blurring the line between public health and private health.
Right. Public health used to be about stopping you from harming others, like containing a contagious disease. But the therapeutic state expands that to protecting you from yourself. Things like smoking, obesity, drug use.
It sounds harmless, but the sources argue it has huge implications for liberty.
Massive. Because when you define undesirable problems like drug addiction or even political dissent as diseases, then the coercion you use to stop them, like mandatory treatment or court-ordered programs, gets rebranded as benevolent treatment.
It's defining violence as beneficence.
That's the term the sources use. And the logic goes even further. If the state provides your medical care, then you're increasingly seen not as a private citizen, but as public property with an obligation to be healthy.
So the state can justify forcing you to wear a motorcycle helmet because it has an interest in you not becoming a burden on their healthcare system.
The underlying assumption is that you lack the willpower to protect yourself, so the state has to step in. Personal self-protection becomes a requirement for political control.
And the radical endpoint of this is someone like Alan Leshner, former head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, saying he thought doctors should be jailed for not forcibly medicating addicts.
That's the ultimate inversion. The state coerces doctors to forcibly drug patients, all under the guise of public health.
So let's connect this back to our engineer. When he was told his insistence on rigid standards was creating an exclusionary environment.
He wasn't getting a technical argument, he was getting a therapeutic mandate. The organization was prioritizing the psychological comfort of the administrators over the physical safety of the airplane.
That's the therapeutic state, in the form of a values alignment audit, directly compromising operational competence.
And that's the mechanism.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem. A meritocracy that creates massive inequality and attempts to fix it with DEI that seem to backfire and create a culture of mediocrity. What are the proposed solutions? Because the critics aren't actually calling for a total dismantling of the system.
No, not at all. You still need qualifications for high-stakes work. The goal isn't to abolish competence metrics, it's to lower the stakes of the whole competition.
To moderate the harmful effects.
Exactly. And the solutions fall into two big buckets. First, proposals for making our institutions less meritocratic, and second, making it matter less that they're meritocratic.
So focusing on that first bucket, making them less meritocratic, the main target is elite education.
That's the source of the privilege multiplication. So one big proposal is to eliminate the tax-exempt status for private universities. The argument is they function like publicly subsidized private clubs for the wealthy.
Take away that subsidy. Another idea is just dramatically expanding enrollment at elite schools.
Right, to dilute the scarcity and therefore the value of those degrees, make them less of a golden ticket.
And then there's the really radical idea from someone like Michael Sandel.
The lottery. He says once an applicant meets the basic threshold of being qualified for an elite school, you stop trying to find microscopic differences in talent and you just use a lottery.
The idea being to kill the hyper-credentialing arms race.
Exactly. And beyond education, there's this idea of distributing non-market goods like political power or social esteem non-meritocratically. Those things shouldn't just go to the person with the highest paying job.
Okay, so that's the first bucket. What about the second one? Making it matter less that our institutions are so competitive.
This is more of a direct economic intervention. The idea is to decouple a person's basic well-being from their success in the market.
So taking more essential goods off the market.
Right. Increasing public ownership of services or, more importantly, turning more things like healthcare, housing, and education into universal entitlements, not commodities you have to buy.
So if your basic survival isn't on the line, the stakes of the meritocratic competition automatically drop. The resentment becomes less about survival and more about status.
And this is where the fight shifts from changing structures to changing the ideology itself. The institutional argument for meritocracy is strong. It does drive efficiency. But the moral argument, the idea of desert, is very weak.
So the critics have to focus on changing the story we tell ourselves.
They do. And there are 3 specific guidelines for doing that. First, just stop using the language of desert.
Stop saying the successful deserve their rewards.
Exactly. Because we've seen that market rewards are arbitrary and depend on luck and privilege. The language should be about entitlement based on the rules of the system, not some pre-existing moral claim.
Second, stop promoting the myth of social mobility.
The self-made story. It's just factually not true for most people in the US and UK. We need to be honest about how constrained opportunities really are. Promoting the myth just blames individuals for systemic failures.
And third, stop valorizing skilled labor over unskilled labor.
A deep cultural habit. We just assume higher pay means higher moral worth. But the 2020 lockdowns completely blew that idea apart.
Right. Suddenly the essential workers were the grocery clerks, the delivery drivers, the hospital cleaners.
People in lower paid, supposedly unskilled roles. Society was forced to see their immense moral value. The ideological fight is about constantly reasserting that value.
Ultimately, the sources suggest that the meritocratic ideology sticks around because it's a powerful psychological defense. It helps us justify our place in the world.
It's false consciousness at its most potent. For the successful, it's a balm for their guilt. For the unsuccessful, it helps them manage their anger by turning it inward.
The self-made individual narrative is the perfect camouflage for all of this.
It is. By shifting all the blame for failure onto the individual, it stops people from thinking about collective action or systemic change. All your energy goes into just trying to get the next credential for yourself.
And that neutralizes any real resistance. The problem isn't that we reward qualifications. It's that the ideology of meritocracy has become this tyrannical justification for extreme inequality that alienates millions of people from their own sense of worth.
So we've journeyed through this whole complex critique. We've seen how the pressure cooker of modern capitalism creates not just wealth, but also intense inequality and resentment. We've looked at how attempts to inject equity can backfire, creating mistrust and prioritizing ideological conformity over actual safety.
And we've seen this cultural shift, where the language of therapeutic victimhood, backed by the therapeutic state, is used to deflect accountability and completely invert what our institutions are for.
What the sources are showing us is a society caught in a very dangerous feedback loop. The inequality from meritocracy justifies the push for equity. That push, when it's done without respecting objective standards, breeds a focus on psychological safety that then undermines the very foundations of competence.
And the ultimate consequence, as that engineer pointed out right at the beginning, is that when institutions prioritize comfort and alignment and ideological purity over the unforgiving demands of reality, the laws of physics don't care. They don't comply. They just wait silently until that cultural rot finally shows up as a spectacular and very, very dangerous failure.